Come closer, my cherished confidants, and gather in the frost of Hawksmere Square, where silence holds its breath and power sharpens its claws. Tonight, the stage is no court of justice, but a theatre of humiliation. A widow stands cloaked in black, her grief fashioned into a weapon against her. Roland de waits upon his dais, sable and velvet, cloaking a heart colder than winter's frost, his tongue armed with lies, his ambition with chains. The crowd presses in, hundreds of eyes fixed on the lone figure of Elara Hawksmere, widow, scapegoat, pawn. The Regent demands her submission. The crowd anticipates her collapse. The script is already written. Denounce her husband as traitor, bow her head and be caged forever in Roland's shadow. Yet even as silence coils tighter around her throat, a different fire begins to stir. Ah, my loves, the scandalous hours grow heavy with consequence. What is an accusation but a spark? And when sparks fall upon frozen earth, sometimes it is not silence that endures, but flame. Tonight, we witness the moment when a widow, meant to be broken, dares instead to accuse the hand that shackles her. Let us step into the square for Chapter 6. The accusation awaits.
The frost-laden air of Hawksmere Square bit deeper than any winter the barony had known. It wasn't just the cold seeping through worn wool and fine velvet. It was the icy grip of anticipation, thick enough to choke on. Hundreds stood packed, shoulder to shoulder, breath pluming in ragged clouds, their collective gaze fixed on the wooden dais erected before the grim stone edifice of the Justiciary Hall. Lord Roland de stood there, a study in controlled power, draped in sable fur over midnight blue velvet, his gloved hands resting lightly on the railing. Below him, isolated on the frost-rimed cobbles, like a single black chess piece, stood the widow of Hawksmere. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone and black wool. The gown, once her armor against the world's prying eyes and sharp condolences, now felt suffocating. It was the shroud of Eamon Hawksmere's fall, the uniform of her imposed grief, and the symbol Roland intended to use to seal his victory. Bess, her maid and only remaining confidant, stood half a step behind, her trembling palpable even through the frigid air, a silent plea for caution radiating from her. Elara could feel the weight of Roland's expectation, a physical pressure bearing down on her. His face, handsome yet chillingly devoid of warmth, held a gloating certainty. He'd won. He'd broken Hawksmere, destroyed Eamon, and now he would break her, publicly, forcing her to renounce the very man whose memory was the last ember of warmth in her frozen world. The crowd, a sea of anxious, curious, or grimly satisfied faces, held its collective breath. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was the taut silence before an execution. "Do it," the silence screamed in her ears, echoing Roland's unspoken command. "Say the words. Condemn him. Save yourself. Survive." The script was etched in acid on her mind. I, Elara Hawksmere, widow of the traitor Eamon, do hereby renounce his memory and deeds, acknowledging the just condemnation brought upon him by the noble Lord Regent Roland de Clerc. The words hovered on her tongue, thick and vile, the taste of absolute surrender of complicity in her husband's murder by slander. It was the key to a gilded cage within Roland's domain, safety bought with her soul, a hollow existence breathing the poisoned air of his triumph. Bess's faint whimper behind her was a knife twist. She took a step forward, not towards Bess's trembling presence, seeking solace, but away from it, away from the illusion of safety the girl represented, towards the dais, towards Roland's expectant, gloating face, now tightening slightly with impatience, towards the silent, watching crowd, holding its collective breath, a monstrous entity waiting to be fed. The movement was small, deliberate, tearing her from the fragile orbit of the only loyalty left to her. The cobbles felt unnaturally solid beneath her thin slippers. She drew herself up to her full height. It wasn't just straightening her spine. It was an unfolding, a casting off. The widow of Hawksmere, the figure of passive grief and quiet, cowed fear that Roland had meticulously cultivated since Eamon's arrest and subsequent suicide in his cell, seemed to slough away like an old, constricting skin. The transformation was invisible, yet seismic. Shoulders that had hunched under the weight of loss and terror squared. Her chin lifted, not in defiance yet, but in a reclaiming of space, of presence. The black wool gown felt less like armor now, more like a banner. A banner declaring not just who she had been, Eamon's wife, the lady of this besieged estate, but crucially, who she refused to be any longer. Roland's pawn, his silent accomplice, the broken symbol of his complete control over Hawksmere's legacy. The scratchy fabric seemed to shift, no longer a shield, but a standard raised against the encroaching darkness. She opened her mouth. The silence didn't just press, it screamed in her ears, a high-pitched whine of pure tension. The expected words, the denial, the condemnation of Eamon that would secure her temporary hollow safety within Roland's cage, hovered on her tongue, bitter as gall, the taste of surrender. She felt the shape of them, the betrayal they formed. Her gaze flickered past Roland, catching the carved stone hawk above the justiciary door. Eamon's hawk, their symbol, watching with sightless stone eyes. A memory, sharp and sudden, Eamon's laugh, warm and full, echoing in the sunlit hall of Hawksmere Keep before the shadows fell. His hand, rough from sword practice but gentle on hers. His voice, fierce with conviction. We stand for truth, Ilara, even when it stands alone. The gall on her tongue turned to ash. A single, sharp collective intake of breath came from the crowd. It wasn't a sigh. It was a gasp that seemed to suck the remaining air from the square, leaving a vacuum colder than the frost. They sensed it, the hesitation, the deviation from the scripted downfall. The creak of Roland's boot, shifting impatiently on the wooden dais, was loud as a gunshot in the stillness. His gloved fingers tightened on the railing, the leather straining. The gloating certainty in his eyes flickered, replaced by a dangerous, questioning intensity. Speak, that shift demanded. Speak the words. High above, indifferent to the human drama unfolding below, the mournful, circling cry of a buzzard riding the cold air currents seemed to underscore the moment's terrible weight, the inevitability of death and scavenging. The sound was a desolate counterpoint to the held breath below, a reminder of the consequences of fallen things. Roland was that buzzard, she realized with crystalline clarity. He'd circled Eamon, picking at his reputation, isolating him, waiting for the kill. He'd circled her, waiting for this moment of weakness, this final surrender. He feasted on carrion of his own making. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring, drawn to its breaking point, waiting for her arrow to fly. Every second elongated, filled with the frantic drumming of her heart, the rasp of her own breath, the rustle of stiffened cloaks in the crowd, the distant, indifferent cry of the scavenger bird. She saw Roland's jaw clench, a tiny muscle leaping beneath the skin. She saw Captain Varrus, commander of the King's Guard detachment, Roland had brought to keep order, shift his weight subtly, his hand drifting nearer the hilt of his sword. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were watchful, assessing the sudden crack in the Regent's facade. She saw faces in the crowd. Old Man Hobb, their former stablemaster, his roomy eyes wide with something akin to dawning hope. Mistress Cray, the mercer's wife, clutching her shawl with knuckles white, fear warring with fascination. The sneering face of Sir Jorik, one of Roland's toadies, already smirking as if savoring her imminent destruction. The fire within her, banked for so long, smothered under grief, terror, and the sheer effort of survival, flared white-hot. It wasn't the frantic, useless heat of panic, nor was it the dull, soul-crushing embers of despair. This was something purer, fiercer, the incandescent fury of truth, long suppressed, finally breaking free. It roared through her veins, a cleansing inferno that seared away the last vestiges of doubt, the lingering instinct for self-preservation that tasted like ashes. The image of Eamon, broken in a cold cell, branded a traitor by the lies Roland spun, filled her vision. The memory of her own months of isolation, of veiled threats, of Bess's constant terror, fanned the flames. The bitter gall of Roland's demanded words dissolved on her tongue, replaced by the clean, sharp tang of defiance. It was metallic, electric, terrifying, and utterly liberating. Roland leaned forward slightly, misinterpreting her stillness, her drawn breath. A predator, scenting capitulation. The dangerous intensity in his eyes smoothed over, replaced by a veneer of expectant satisfaction. A faint, satisfied smile touched his lips. Yes, his entire posture screamed, radiating smug triumph from the dais. Crawl. Beginning. Save your pathetic skin. Admit his guilt and embrace your cage. He might as well have spoken the words aloud. The buzzard circled, lower now. Her voice, when it finally came, shattered the silence like falling glass. It wasn't loud, not initially. It didn't need to be. It cut through the frigid air with unnatural clarity, vibrating with the suppressed power of years of silence, years of swallowed grief and stifled rage. It was the sound of a dam breaking. No. The single syllable hung, stark and unexpected, in the vacuum left by the crowd's gasp. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a shout. It was a statement, simple, final, and utterly earth-shattering in that context. The effect was instantaneous. Roland's smile froze. It didn't fade. It solidified into a grotesque mask, a rictus of disbelief etched onto his handsome features. Then, slowly, like ice cracking under sudden pressure, it melted into confusion. His brows drew together, his head tilting infinitesimally, as if he hadn't heard correctly. Then, as the word echoed in the stunned silence, it hardened into disbelief, rapidly darkening into a fury so profound it seemed to leach the color from his face. The predator's confidence evaporated, replaced by the stunned rage of one who has been unexpectedly struck. A ripple of shock went through the crowd, a visible shudder that passed from the front ranks to the very back, a murmur that swelled like the first stirrings of a storm, low, confused, tinged with awe and burgeoning tension. People exchanged wide-eyed glances. Someone dropped a basket, the clatter unnaturally loud. Bess stifled a sob behind her, a sound of pure terror, quickly swallowed by the rising tide of astonishment. Alara didn't dare look back, but she felt the girls' trembling intensify. Faces transformed, passive expectation shattered into mosaics of shock, confusion, dawning apprehension, and, in hidden corners, among the weathered faces of farmers who remembered Eamon's fairness, among the older servants half hidden in the throng, a flicker of something else. Was it hope? A spark long extinguished, fanned by that single, impossible word? Roland remained frozen for a heartbeat longer, a statue of outraged authority. Then he moved. No, he echoed, his voice dangerously low, losing its usual smooth modulation. It was a velvet glove over iron, but the velvet was tearing. He took a deliberate step to the very edge of the dais, looming over her, attempting to reassert his physical and social dominance. His shadow fell across her, cold and oppressive. No. What, lady? The title was a sneer. Speak plainly. Denounce the traitor Eamon Hawksmere, as you agreed. He leaned further, his voice dropping, carrying only to her and the nearest onlookers, laced with venomous threat. For your own sake, remember your position. His glacial eyes locked onto hers, stripping away any pretense. Remember the consequences of misplaced loyalty. The unspoken promise hung in the air. Pain, disappearance, the destruction of everything and everyone she might still care about, Bess included. The threat, instead of cowing her, focused the white-hot fire raging within. It burned away the last remnants of fear, leaving only crystalline clarity. She saw it all. The meticulously crafted campaign against Eamon, the engineered whispers planted in taverns and court corridors, the forged documents subtly hinted at, the isolation enforced by Roland's cronies, turning allies wary, then distant. She saw Eamon's growing frustration, his bewilderment at the shifting loyalties, his final, desperate attempts to clear his name before the inevitable arrest on trumped-up charges of conspiring with the old king's exiled brother. She saw the way Roland had circled Hawksmere like the buzzard above, waiting for weakness, waiting for her weakness after Eamon was gone, waiting to pick the estate clean and use her grief as the final tool to cement his narrative. The gown was a banner, not of mourning, but of rebellion. The color of mourning transformed into the color of war. She took another step, closing the distance to the dais, refusing to be diminished by his height or his shadow. The cobbles were icy beneath her feet, but she planted herself firmly. Her gaze locked onto Roland's, no longer avoiding his cold, assessing stare, but meeting it head-on. She saw the flicker of surprise in his eyes, quickly masked by fury. The fear was gone, burned away in that cleansing fire. What remained was a terrifying calm, a still center in the maelstrom she was unleashing. It was the calm of absolute conviction, of having nothing left to lose. "I deny nothing," she stated, her voice gaining strength, resonating now with that inner fire. It rang out over the hushed square, no longer just cutting the air, but filling it, carrying past the first few rows. It reached the merchants, clutching their wares, their calculations momentarily forgotten. The farmers with dirt still under their nails, their stoicism cracking, the guards whose hands tightened on their pikes, their loyalty to Roland, warring with the sheer audacity unfolding before them. Because there is nothing to deny. She paused, letting the absolute negation hang, a challenge thrown down. Eamon Hawksmere was no traitor. The name, spoken clearly, defiantly, without shame, was itself a weapon. He was a loyal man, a good man. Her voice thickened with emotion she no longer tried to suppress. Betrayed by shadows and whispers orchestrated from the very heart of power he served. She raised her voice slightly, ensuring the accusation carried. Betrayed by those who feared his integrity, his loyalty to the true crown. Her gaze never left Roland's, not the shifting sands of favor. Roland's face drained of its smug color, replaced by a mask of fury so intense it seemed to crack the veneer of his composure. A vein pulsed at his temple. "You dare!" he roared, his voice shredding, losing its silken control, becoming a raw scrape of anger. He whirled, gesturing sharply to Captain Varrus, who stood rigid at the foot of the dais, his face a study in conflicted duty. "Silence this mad woman. Take her." Varrus hesitated. His hand, which had drifted towards his sword hilt, froze. His eyes darted between Roland's furious command and the defiant widow, standing like a lone sentinel before the crowd. He knew the orders. He knew the consequences of disobeying the Regent. But he also knew Eamon Hawksmere. He'd served under him years ago. He knew the character of the man Roland had destroyed. And he saw, in Alara's eyes, not madness, but a terrifying, righteous clarity. The crowd murmured louder, the sound shifting from shock to a low thrum of unease, a wave of unease cresting. The order felt wrong, brutal, against a woman making an accusation, however outrageous, in the public square. Guards near Varrus shifted their weight, looking to their captain for guidance, their own discipline wavering. Alara seized the moment of hesitation, the crack in Roland's control. "I dare," she interrupted Roland, her voice cutting through his command, gaining momentum, fueled by the fire that now felt like a sun blazing within her. "I dare to speak the truth you have tried so hard to bury beneath the lies and innuendo." She turned slightly, addressing not just Roland, but the crowd, the stones of Hawksmere, the memory of her husband. You speak of cages, Lord Roland. Her voice dripped with scorn. Look to your own construction. She swept her arm out in a wide, encompassing gesture, encompassing the stunned crowd, the dais, the imposing Justiciary Hall. You built a cage of lies around Eamon, brick by treacherous brick, false testimony, forged seals, whispered rumors you nurtured like poisonous weeds. Her voice rose, ringing with accusation. And you thought to build another around me, using my grief, my fear. Her gaze flickered towards Bess, then back to Roland with burning intensity, as your tools. You thought my silence, my broken spirit, would be the mortar to seal his fate forever. She swept a hand out again, emphasizing the spectacle. You brought them here, she cried, her voice resonating with furious passion. You brought them here to witness my humiliation, my forced complicity in your slander. To see the widow of Hawksmere broken and compliant, she spat the words. A final nail in Eamon's coffin, a living testament to your triumph. You thought my voice, when it finally spoke, would echo your lies. Her eyes swept the faces before her, locking for a fleeting second with the wide-eyed baker's wife clutching her flour-dusted apron, meeting the stoic blacksmith whose massive arms were crossed over his leather apron, his expression unreadable, but his posture attentive, catching the eye of the young nobleman near the front, Lord Peter's son, whose expression had shifted from detached boredom to sharp, almost alarmed interest, scanning the faces of tenants who had worked Hawksmere land for generations, their expressions weathered, but now alight with a complex mix of shock, fear, and something deeper. She saw confusion, yes, but also dawning realization. Pieces of the past year clicking into a different, uglier picture. And for some, especially among the older folk near the edges and the grizzled veterans clustered near the tavern door, a flicker of old loyalty, long suppressed under Roland's regime, began to glow, tentative but unmistakable. Memories of Eamon's fairness, his courage during the border skirmishes, his respect for the land and its people, surfaced against the tide of Roland's propaganda. You wanted a spectacle? Alara demanded, her voice rising to a clarion call that echoed off the stone buildings surrounding the square. Then witness this. She drew herself up even taller, seeming to grow in stature despite her isolation. The black wool caught the weak winter light, not absorbing it, but reflecting it dully, making her seem less a mourner and more an avenging spirit risen from the crypts of Hawksmere. Every eye was riveted upon her. Even Roland seemed momentarily transfixed by the sheer force of her transformation. She pointed, not vaguely towards the past, not at the indifferent sky, not at some phantom memory of Eamon, but directly at Roland de Clerc, standing exposed on his wooden stage, his mask of control utterly shattered. Her arm was steady, her finger and arrow aimed unerringly at his heart. The traitor is not my dead husband. The accusation exploded into the silence. The scavenger circling the corpse of his honor is not that buzzard. Her voice rose, sharp and clear as a cracked bell, carrying to the farthest edge of the square, where children peered between adult legs and vendors paused, their hushed arguments, drawn by the raw power in her words. It was the voice of Hawksmere, not the broken remnant, but proud and unyielding, resurrected in the heart of its mistress. The true traitor stands before you now. She paused, letting the indictment hang, heavy and lethal, the architect of lies. Each word was a hammer blow. The poisoner of truth. Her voice throbbed with contempt. The man who would sacrifice loyal men on the altar of his ambition and grind grieving widows beneath his heel. She took a breath that filled the square. Roland de Clerc. The gasp this time was thunderous, a visceral, collective shockwave that rippled through the packed bodies. It wasn't just surprise. It was the sound of a worldview fracturing. People recoiled as if struck. Some pressed hands to mouths in disbelief. Others leaned forward, eyes wide with a terrible fascination. The spectacle Roland had craved transformed into his own nightmare. Guards shifted uncertainly, their discipline crumbling further. Their formation loosening as they glanced at each other and at Varrus, whose face had turned grim, etched with deep conflict. He hadn't moved to obey Roland's order. His hand was still away from his sword. The most profound reaction was Roland's. He took a physical step back, an instinctive recoil from the verbal blow. His heel caught the edge of a plank, causing him to stumble slightly, a shocking loss of dignity. His face was a grotesque mask of shock and incandescent rage. The carefully constructed image of the calm, powerful regent lay in ruins. He looked less like a lord and more like a cornered, venomous beast, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and filled with pure, unadulterated hatred. His mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before a strangled sound emerged. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. "He speaks of cages," she cried, the white-hot fire blazing into an inferno of accusation that seemed to radiate heat in the frozen square. She turned fully to the crowd now, her voice encompassing them all. "He seeks to cage us all with fear and deceit, to silence dissent with threats, to blind us with lies." She looked back at Roland, her gaze a lance. "But I will not be silenced. I will not condemn an innocent man to further your web of falsehoods. I condemn you, Roland de Clerc." Her voice cracked with the force of her emotion, but did not break. "For the lies that blackened a good man's name and brought shame upon these stones." She gestured towards the keep looming in the distance. "For the betrayal of the trust placed in you by the crown and by the people of this barony." Her voice dropped slightly, thick with grief and fury. "For the murder of my husband's honor and his legacy." The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than before, pressing down like a physical weight. It was the silence after an explosion, deafening in its totality. The only sounds were the ragged breathing of the crowd, the distant, relentless, mournful, circling cry of a buzzard, riding the cold air currents, seemed to underscore the moment's terrible weight, the inevitability of death and scavenging. Roland stood utterly still, momentarily paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her defiance. His knuckles were white where they gripped the edge of the dais, the only color in his ashen face, the twin points of fury burning in his eyes. His chest rose and fell rapidly beneath the rich velvet of his doublet. The shock was receding, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. His gaze, when it finally met hers again, held no gloating, no calculation, only a cold, terrifying promise of annihilation. It was a look that stripped away any illusion of safety, any lingering hope of mercy. It said, "You are dead. You just don't know it yet." Her arrow had flown. It had been loosed from the taut bowstring of that unbearable silence. It had found its mark, deep and true, piercing the heart of Roland's carefully constructed authority. And the fragile, enforced peace of the square, like the taut bowstring, had snapped with an almost audible crack. The fragile veneer of Roland's control lay shattered on the cobbles. The consequences, as inevitable as the scavenger's descent, began to gather like storm clouds on the horizon. Her defiance hung in the air, a tangible, dangerous thing, electrifying the crowd, whose murmurs were now rising again. No longer just shock, but a turbulent mix of awe, fear, and burgeoning anger, paralyzing Roland's guards for a crucial moment, their eyes still darting between their enraged master and their conflicted captain, shattering the carefully controlled narrative Roland had spent a year weaving. The truth, raw and dangerous, was now loose in Hawksmere Square. The widow of Hawksmere was passive no longer. The figure of quiet grief had been incinerated in that white-hot fire. She had drawn her line in the frost-hardened earth of the square, a line drawn in words of fire and ice, and Roland de Clerc stood on the other side, exposed, humiliated, his true nature laid bare for all to see. His mask finally, irrevocably, torn away. The scandalous whispers were whispers no more. The scandal wasn't just whispered in shadowed corners anymore. It had erupted onto the public stage in a blaze of accusation, a fire she had ignited. The true battle for Hawksmere, for Eamon's name, for her own survival, had just begun. Not with swords, but with truth. And truth, she knew with cold certainty, was the weapon Roland feared most. The silence stretched, pregnant with the thunder of what was to come. It was the calm, before the counterstrike. Roland's lips peeled back from his teeth in a silent snarl, a promise of violence contained only by the public eye. Captain Varrus finally moved, stepping forward decisively, not towards Alara, but positioning himself slightly between her and the dais, his hand now firmly on his sword hilt. His face was set, his decision made, at least for this moment. Protection? Or merely preventing immediate bloodshed? A low growl started in the crowd, a sound of confusion, solidifying into anger. But directed at whom? At the widow for her audacity? At Roland for his tyranny? At the guards for their inaction? It was impossible yet to tell. The buzzard screamed again, circling lower, a dark omen against the leaden sky. The scandalous hours had reached their boiling point, and the kettle had just been kicked over. The explosion, when it came, would reshape everything. Alara held her ground, the cold air biting her face, the taste of defiance still sharp on her tongue, waiting for the storm to break.
And so, darlings, the frost-laden silence of Hawksmere was shattered, not by Roland's decree, but by Alara's voice, a single word that cut deeper than any blade. Number. A widow's defiance has toppled the Regent's script, splintered his control, and left the crowd gasping in scandal. With that one syllable, the meek mourner became something far more dangerous, a woman who will not be silenced. Roland's mask has cracked, his fury laid bare before the people he sought to command. And yet, what is truth without consequence? The guards hesitate, the crowd trembles, and the air itself tastes of rebellion. Ilara's words have loosed an arrow that cannot be recalled, its flight piercing Roland's power, igniting whispers of doubt and perhaps of hope. But make no mistake, my loves, the Regent will not forgive. His fury is a storm, and storms batter all in their path. What will become of Ilara, of Bess, of Hawksmere itself, now that the accusation has been hurled like a torch into dry straw? The scandal has broken free, and the hours ahead will bleed with retribution. Stay close, confidants, for in the next chapter, the iron doors of Hawksmere Tower will slam, and the cost of courage will be counted in chains and blood.